I'm Sarah Mitchell, 32, and I thought I was the responsible daughter who'd finally made my parents proud. After years of working two jobs while studying, I'd just gotten accepted into law school, my dream since I was 12. But when I called home to share the news and ask about accessing my college fund, my mother's words shattered everything I believed about family loyalty. "Oh, honey, we gave that money to your brother last year for his startup. You're so independent. We knew you'd figure it out." $24,000 gone. The fund my grandparents had specifically set up for my education, handed over to my brother, who'd already failed at 3 different business ventures. That night, as I sat in my tiny apartment calculating how I'd never afford law school, I made a decision that would change everything. My parents had always underestimated me, treating me like the backup child, while my brother got everything handed to him. But they had no idea what I was really capable of. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, hit that like button. You'll want to hear what happened next. Growing up, I should have seen the signs. There's a family photo from my high school graduation that tells the whole story, me standing slightly apart while my parents beam at Marcus, who's front and center despite it being my day. Even then, at 17, I was already learning to make myself smaller to accommodate his needs. Marcus is 3 years older, and from the moment he could walk, he was the sun around which our family orbited. When he failed his first grade math tests, Mom hired a tutor. When I struggled with algebra 2 years later, I was told to figure it out because I was naturally smart. When Marcus crashed Dad's car at 16, they bought him a newer one. When I asked to borrow the family car for my job interview at 17, I was lectured about responsibility. The pattern was so consistent it became normal. Marcus's failures were learning experiences that required financial support. My successes were expected and therefore unremarkable. When he dropped out of college after 2 years, spending thousands on parties and failing grades, my parents nodded sympathetically about him finding his path. When I graduated summa cum laude with a double major while working 20 hours a week, I got a card and dinner at Applebee's. But it was the business ventures that really opened my eyes to the scope of their favoritism. First, there was the organic dog treat company. When Marcus was 23, Dad invested $8,000 for equipment and ingredients. The business lasted 6 months before Marcus lost interest, leaving bags of moldy dog treats in my parents' garage for 2 years. Then came the vintage clothing resale shop. Mom and Dad co-signed a lease, bought initial inventory, and even worked weekends helping him organize merchandise. Marcus spent more time posting Instagram photos of himself looking entrepreneurial than actually selling anything. When the lease expired after a year, they lost their security deposit and were stuck with boxes of musty clothes. The food truck venture was supposed to be different. Marcus had spent months developing what he called a revolutionary fusion concept, Korean-Mexican fusion, which wasn't remotely revolutionary, but nobody told him that. He presented my parents with a detailed business plan complete with projected profits and expansion dreams. They were so proud of his maturity and business acumen. What they didn't know, what I discovered later, was that Marcus had copied most of the business plan from a successful food truck in Portland, changing only the name and location. The financial projections were pure fantasy, the permits were incomplete, and he had no actual experience in food service. But my parents saw their golden child finally taking initiative, and they were determined to make his dreams come true. That's when they decided my college fund was available. After all, Marcus needed the money now, and I was so capable that I'd surely find another way to pay for law school. The decision was made without consulting me, without considering my plans, without acknowledging that the money had been specifically designated for my education by my grandmother. Standing in my apartment that night, staring at the law school acceptance letter I'd worked so hard to earn, I realized I'd spent my entire life being the understanding daughter, the flexible one, the one who could handle disappointment because I was strong. But strength had become synonymous with being last in line for love, support, and basic consideration. 3 days after the devastating phone call, I sat at my laptop with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, determined to understand the full scope of what my family had done. I'd always been good with numbers. It's what made me excellent at my accounting job and successful with my personal investments. Now I was going to put those skills to work uncovering the truth. I started with what I could access legally. My parents had added me to their main checking account when I turned 18, supposedly for emergencies, though I'd never used it. They'd forgotten to remove me, and I'd forgotten it existed until now. The online banking login information was still saved in my browser from years ago when I'd helped Dad set up automatic bill pay. What I found was staggering. The college fund wasn't just one transaction. Over the past 18 months, there had been a steady stream of transfers. First, small amounts, 500 here, $800 they're labeled as family expenses or emergency funds. Then larger chunks, $2,000 for vehicle repairs that I knew was actually for Marcus's food truck equipment, $3,500 for home improvements that coincided exactly with his permit fees and initial inventory purchases. But the pattern went back much further than I'd realized. I scrolled through 3 years of statements, watching my family's financial decisions unfold in stark black and white numbers. The organic dog treat disaster had cost them nearly $12,000. When you included the failed inventory, the equipment they couldn't sell, and the storage unit rental they'd paid for 8 months to house the remnants. The vintage clothing shop was even worse. Beyond the lease co-signing and initial investment, there were monthly loans to Marcus when sales were poor, payments for advertising that never materialized into customers, and eventually the cleanup costs when he abandoned the lease with 2 months remaining. Each venture followed the same pattern: initial enthusiasm and investment, followed by a cascade of additional emergency support when things went wrong, which they always did. And through it all, Marcus never contributed his own money. He never even got a part-time job to supplement the businesses. He was a professional dreamer, funded entirely by our parents' steadily depleting savings. I found the college fund statements buried in a subfolder of Dad's email, which I still had access to from when I'd helped him organize his digital files 2 years ago. My grandmother had established the fund when I was 10, contributing $200 monthly until her death when I was 16. Combined with compound interest, it should have grown to nearly $28,000. Instead, the balance showed zero. The final transfer had been made just 3 weeks before my law school acceptance. Every penny that my grandmother had carefully saved for my education had been liquidated to fund Marcus's food truck dream. The transaction notes were clinical and devastating. Transfer to checking for family business investment, but there was something else in those statements that made my blood run cold. A series of emails between my parents and their financial advisor, discussing the reallocation of family educational resources and whether they should inform Sarah about the change in funding strategy. The advisor had actually recommended consulting with me first, noting that the original fund documentation specified it was designated for my educational expenses only. My parents had chosen to override that recommendation. In one email, Mom had written, "Sarah is so responsible and independent. She'll find a way to make it work. Marcus needs this opportunity to finally find his footing, and we can't let him down again." Dad's response was even more telling. "We can always help Sarah later if she really needs it. But this might be Marcus's last chance to prove himself." I wasn't just the backup plan. I was the sacrifice they were willing to make to keep believing in their golden child's eventual success. As I sat there in the glow of my laptop screen, scrolling through years of financial evidence, something fundamental shifted inside me. I'd spent my whole life trying to earn their approval, trying to prove I was worthy of their attention and support. But the numbers told a different story. They told the story of parents who had already decided which child mattered more, and it wasn't me. The next morning, I decided to see Marcus's revolutionary food truck business for myself. According to his Instagram posts, which were filled with inspirational quotes about entrepreneurship and gratuitous selfies, he was operating out of the downtown business district on weekdays. I took a long lunch break and drove across town to find him. The food truck was impossible to miss, not because it was busy, but because it was parked alone in a lot where 3 other food trucks had clusters of customers around them. Marcus's truck, painted an eye-searing combination of orange and purple that he probably thought was bold branding, sat empty except for him scrolling through his phone inside. I watched from my car for 20 minutes. In that time, the Korean barbecue truck next to him served at least 30 customers. The gourmet grilled cheese truck on his other side had a steady line. Marcus served exactly 2 people, and one of them appeared to be a friend who stayed to chat for 10 minutes, probably not even paying. When I finally approached his window, Marcus's face lit up with surprise. "Sarah, what are you doing here? Isn't this awesome?" He gestured proudly at the interior of the truck, which looked like an expensive kitchen that had been barely used. Just wanted to see the business that required my college fund, I said, keeping my voice neutral. His enthusiasm dimmed slightly, but he pushed forward with his sales pitch. You have to try the Korean Mexican fusion tacos. They're going to revolutionize street food in the city. I've got bulgogi beef with kimchi salsa and Korean fried chicken with sriracha aioli. I ordered a bulgogi taco more to see the business in action than because I was hungry. Marcus moved around the truck with the kind of theatrical efficiency of someone performing rather than working. The taco, when it finally arrived after an unnecessarily long preparation time, was mediocre at best. The bulgogi was clearly pre-made and reheated. The kimchi tasted like it came from a jar, and the tortilla was the kind you buy in bulk from restaurant supply stores. This is interesting, I said, taking a bite. How's business been? It's building momentum, Marcus replied, with the kind of desperate optimism I'd heard from him before every previous business failure. You know how it is with startups, it takes time to build a customer base, but I'm confident we'll be profitable by month 6. I looked around at the empty space in front of his truck while the neighboring businesses continued serving steady streams of customers. What makes you think 6 months will be different? I'm implementing a comprehensive social media strategy, he said, pulling out his phone to show me charts and graphs that looked impressive until you realize they showed followers and likes rather than actual sales figures. And I'm developing relationships with local businesses for catering contracts. Have you gotten any catering contracts yet? Well, not yet, but I have several promising leads. It was the same pattern I'd seen with every one of his ventures: big dreams, professional-sounding language, and a complete disconnect from reality. I suspected his promising leads were probably people who had politely said they'd keep him in mind for future events. How much did this whole setup cost? I asked, gesturing at the truck and equipment. Marcus's chest puffed out with pride. The truck lease is $800 a month, plus insurance and permits. The initial equipment and inventory investment was about $18,000. Then there's daily operational costs: ingredients, fuel, permits, marketing. Mom and Dad have been incredible supporters of my vision. $18,000. My entire college fund, plus additional money my parents had somehow scraped together. For a food truck business that was clearly failing, run by someone who had no experience in food service and no realistic understanding of the market. The thing is, Marcus continued, leaning closer with the conspiratorial tone he used when he wanted something, I could really use some additional working capital to get through the startup phase. I know you're doing well with your accounting job. Maybe you could invest in the business? I could offer you a partnership stake. I stared at him, this 31-year-old man who had never held a steady job, never contributed to any of his previous failed businesses, and had just casually consumed my educational future. He was asking me to fund his dream while mine lay in ruins. I'll think about it, I said, handing him back the half-eaten taco. As I walked back to my car, I heard him call out, "This is going to be huge, Sarah. You'll want to get in on the ground floor." I drove back to work with a strange sense of clarity. The food truck wasn't a business, it was an expensive hobby funded by my parents' blind faith and my grandmother's careful savings. Marcus wasn't an entrepreneur. He was a dreamer who had never learned the difference between wanting something and working for it. But more than that, I realized something important about myself. I'd spent years watching Marcus fail upward, always caught by the safety net of family money and unconditional support. I'd assumed that meant he was luckier than me, more loved, more valued. Now I understood the truth. He wasn't more loved, he was more dependent. And that dependence had made him weak, entitled, and ultimately unsuccessful. While I'd been building real skills, real accomplishments, and real financial security through my own efforts, he'd been learning to rely on other people's money to fund his fantasies. The question was, what was I going to do with that knowledge? That weekend, I drove to my parents' house for the first time in 3 months. They were surprised to see me. I usually called before visiting, but welcomed me with the kind of enthusiastic warmth they reserved for the child they saw less often. It was a sharp contrast to how they greeted Marcus, who showed up unannounced several times a week and was treated like a permanent fixture. "Sarah, what a wonderful surprise," Mom said, pulling me into a hug that felt more guilty than affectionate. "We were just talking about you." "Nothing bad, I hope," I replied, though I suspected otherwise. Dad emerged from his study, looking older than I'd remembered. "How's work going?" Still enjoying the accounting firm? They made small talk about my job, my apartment, my life, with the kind of polite interest they showed acquaintances. Then Mom asked the question I'd been expecting. How are you handling the law school situation? We know it's disappointing, but you're so resourceful. You'll figure something out. Resourceful. Their favorite word for me, which really meant we're not going to help you, but we have confidence you'll solve it yourself. Actually, that's partly why I'm here, I said. I wanted to look through some of Grandma's old papers. You know how organized she was. I thought there might be some information about educational grants or scholarships she researched. Mom's face brightened. What a smart idea. You always were so thorough. Her papers are still in the guest room closet. Help yourself. I spent the afternoon methodically going through 3 boxes of my grandmother's documents, while my parents puttered around the house. Grandma Ruth had indeed been organized. Every important paper was filed, labeled, and stored in chronological order. Insurance policies, tax returns, correspondence with her financial advisor, and then in a folder marked Sarah's Education Fund. Exactly what I was looking for. The original fund documentation was comprehensive and unambiguous. Grandma Ruth had established the account specifically for my educational expenses, with detailed instructions about its use. The fund was to be used exclusively for my college, graduate school, or professional training. In the event that I didn't pursue higher education, the money was to be donated to educational charities, not redistributed to other family members. But more importantly, there was a copy of her will and an amendment she'd added just 6 months before her death. The amendment specifically addressed the education fund, stating that if the designated funds were used for any purpose other than my education without my explicit written consent, the action would constitute a violation of her testamentary wishes and could be grounds for legal action. She'd also included a letter, sealed in an envelope marked for Sarah's eyes only. Inside, in her careful handwriting, was a message that brought tears to my eyes. My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, it means you're preparing for your education, and I'm no longer there to see you succeed. I've watched you work harder than anyone in this family, and I've also watched how often your efforts go unnoticed while others receive credit and support for far less. This fund is for you alone. I've seen how your parents favor Marcus, and while I love him, I know that giving him money has never helped him become stronger or more responsible. You, on the other hand, have shown that you can transform opportunities into achievements. I've made the legal language very clear. This money is for your education only. If anyone tries to use it for other purposes, they're not just taking your money, they're violating my final wishes for my granddaughter's future. Don't let them convince you that you're being selfish for expecting what's rightfully yours. I sat on the guest room bed, holding my grandmother's letter, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The sensation of being truly seen and valued by a family member. Grandma Ruth had understood the family dynamics that I'd thought were invisible. She'd witnessed the favoritism, the expectation that I should be grateful for less, the assumption that I was strong enough to handle disappointment while Marcus was too fragile to face consequences. More than that, she'd taken legal steps to protect my future from exactly what had happened. I photographed every document, then carefully returned them to their folders. When I rejoined my parents in the living room, they asked if I'd found anything helpful, some useful information. I said. Grandma was very thorough about documenting her wishes. Dad nodded approvingly. She always said you were the most like her, practical and forward-thinking. She'd be proud of how you're handling this situation. The irony was staggering. They were praising me for being like the grandmother whose explicit wishes they'd violated. When they stole my education fund, they thought I was being admirable by quietly accepting their betrayal, when the woman they claimed to respect had specifically tried to prevent exactly this scenario. She would have wanted me to succeed, I agreed. She always believed in investing in education. As I drove home that evening, I felt a strange combination of grief and empowerment. Grief for the grandmother who had tried to protect me from beyond the grave, and empowerment from knowing that I wasn't wrong to feel betrayed. The people who raised me to believe family loyalty meant accepting whatever treatment they decided to give me had violated not just my trust, but the explicit wishes of the woman who'd raised them. I had legal grounds to challenge what they'd done. I had documentation proving the money was meant exclusively for my education. I had evidence that they'd known this and chosen to ignore it. The question was, what was I going to do with that power? By the time I reached my apartment, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to pursue immediate legal action that would be reactive, emotional, and ultimately less satisfying than what I had in mind. Instead, I was going to do something that would teach them the true cost of their choices while honoring my grandmother's belief in the power of education. I was going to give them exactly what they'd given me, a lesson in consequences. Monday morning, I requested a personal day from work and drove to the office of Jennifer Martinez, the attorney who'd handled my grandmother's estate. I'd met her briefly during the probate process, and she'd impressed me with her thoroughness and no-nonsense approach to family law. "Sarah, good to see you again," she said, gesturing me into her office. "How can I help you?" I laid out the situation methodically, providing copies of all the documents I'd found. Jennifer reviewed them with the kind of focused attention that reminded me why I'd liked her immediately. When I finished explaining, she leaned back in her chair and whistled softly. "This is pretty clear-cut," she said. "Your parents violated the terms of the fund, and they did so knowingly. You have grounds for legal action to recover the money, plus potential damages. I'm not interested in suing them," I said. "Not yet. Anyway, I want to understand my options, but I'm more interested in, let's call it creative justice." Jennifer raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening. I want to make a point about the value of education and the consequences of betraying family trust. But I want to do it in a way that's legally unassailable and morally justified." We spent an hour discussing various approaches. Jennifer explained that while I could certainly pursue legal remedies, there were other ways to respond that might be more personally satisfying. She also helped me understand something important. My parents' financial situation was likely more precarious than they'd let on. The pattern you've described: repeated bailouts of your brother, depletion of designated funds, mortgage increases, suggests they're living beyond their means and have been for some time, she said. People who make fiscally responsible decisions don't typically raid their children's education funds. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done before. I conducted a thorough investigation of my own family's financial situation. It felt invasive and wrong, but after what they'd done to me, I reasoned that understanding the full scope of their decisions was necessary for my own protection. I started with public records. Property tax assessments showed they'd refinanced their house twice in the past 5 years, increasing their mortgage debt significantly. Credit reports, which I could access legally through my name being on several old family accounts, revealed a troubling pattern of increasing debt and decreasing savings. But it was my own financial investigation that revealed the most important information. While I'd been living in my small apartment, driving my reliable but modest car, and maintaining what everyone assumed was a typical young professional lifestyle, I'd actually been building substantial wealth. It started in college, when I'd invested my work-study earnings in index funds instead of spending them on social activities. While my classmates were going to bars and buying expensive textbooks, I was learning about compound interest and dollar cost averaging. By graduation, I had nearly $15,000 in investments. My accounting job paid well, and I'd continued living like a student while investing aggressively. No expensive rent, no car payments, no designer clothes or expensive vacations. Every bonus, every tax refund, every bit of extra income went into a diversified portfolio of stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The result, after 6 years of consistent investing in market growth, was a portfolio worth just over $180,000. I'd never told my family about my investments. They assumed my frugal lifestyle meant I was struggling financially, when in reality, it meant I was building long-term security. While they were funding Marcus's fantasies and depleting their retirement savings, I was quietly becoming financially independent. The irony was profound. They'd stolen my college fund because they assumed I needed their money to succeed, when I actually had enough to pay for law school myself. But more than that, I had enough to make a statement that would be both legally sound and devastatingly effective. I spent the evening running calculations and researching charitable organizations. Educational charities, specifically organizations that provided scholarships to students whose families couldn't afford college, students who were exactly in the position my parents had put me in. The plan that emerged was elegant in its justice. My parents had violated my grandmother's wishes by taking money designated for education and giving it to Marcus for his business ventures. I was going to honor my grandmother's wishes by taking money designated for my future security and giving it to education, just not my own. They'd taught me that family money could be redirected without consent when someone else's needs seemed more pressing. I was going to teach them what it felt like to watch substantial money go somewhere they hadn't chosen, for reasons they couldn't argue with. But first, I needed to gather more information about their current financial situation. Because the most effective lessons are always the ones that come at exactly the right moment when the students are most ready to learn, I opened my laptop and began researching my parents' retirement accounts, investment statements, and financial planning documents. They'd shared access to these accounts with me years ago during a health scare, and like the checking account, they'd never revoked my access. What I found was even worse than I'd suspected. Their retirement savings, which should have been substantial, after 30 years of dual incomes, had been systematically depleted, not just from Marcus's business ventures, but for years of overspending, poor investment choices, and the kind of financial decisions that prioritize short-term comfort over long-term security. They were, in financial terms, a disaster waiting to happen. And they had no idea I knew. The following Tuesday, my phone rang at 7:30 a.m. It was Marcus, and he was in full panic mode. "Sarah, thank God you answered. I need your help. Everything is falling apart." I sat up in bed, instantly alert. "What's wrong?" "The food truck lease, they're terminating it. And my apartment complex just served me an eviction notice. I'm behind on rent, and the truck payments, and the insurance, and," his voice cracked, "I don't know what to do." "Slow down," I said, though internally I was calculating timelines. "When did this happen?" "The truck lease termination came yesterday. 3 months behind on payments. And the eviction notice was on my door when I got home last night. I have 30 days to pay everything I owe or they're throwing me out." I'd been expecting this call, though perhaps not quite so soon. Marcus's business had been failing visibly for weeks, and his social media posts had become increasingly desperate, full of flash sales and limited time offers that screamed of someone trying to generate quick cash. "How much do you owe?" I asked. "Between the truck lease, the apartment rent, utilities, insurance, and the equipment loans," he paused, and I could hear papers rustling. "About $8,400 total. But if I can just get caught up, I know I can turn this around. The business is so close to profitability." $8,400. Nearly a third of what had been in my college fund, and probably more than my parents currently had in liquid savings, based on my research into their finances. "Have you talked to Mom and Dad about this?" "That's the thing," Marcus said, and his voice took on a tone I'd heard before, the wheedling, manipulative tone he used when he was about to ask for something unreasonable. "They're kind of tapped out right now. Dad's been stressed about some work stuff, and Mom mentioned they're being more careful with spending." What he wasn't saying was that they'd already exhausted their readily available funds, bailing him out of previous crises. The pattern I'd observed in their financial records was reaching its inevitable conclusion. "So you're calling me," I said. "You're my sister, and I know you've always been good with money. You must have some savings." The audacity was breathtaking. The same person who had consumed my entire education fund without a second thought was now asking me to solve his latest financial crisis. But what made it even more infuriating was the assumption underlying his request that I existed primarily to serve as a backup plan for his failures. "Marcus, let me ask you something. When you and our parents decided to use my college fund for your business, did anyone consider what would happen if the business failed?" "That's different," he said quickly. "That was an investment in my future, and this is what exactly? This is just a temporary setback. Every business has challenges in the first year. Your organic dog treat business had challenges. Your vintage clothing store had challenges. Your freelance graphic design work had challenges. At what point do challenges become a pattern?" "Why are you being so mean?" Marcus's voice shifted to the hurt, confused tone he'd perfected as a child. "I'm in trouble, and instead of helping me, you're lecturing me about ancient history. I'm not being mean. I'm being realistic. And I'm asking you to consider something that apparently no one in our family has ever asked you to consider. What's your plan for becoming financially independent?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long, I thought he might have hung up. "Sarah, I just need help getting through this rough patch. Once I'm caught up on payments, I can focus on building the business." "With what money? If you're behind on all your bills, where is the operating capital going to come from? Where is next month's rent going to come from?" "I'll figure it out. I always do." "No, Marcus, you don't figure it out. Mom and Dad figure it out. They've been figuring it out for you for 8 years. And now they can't anymore. I could hear him starting to cry, and despite everything, I felt a pang of sympathy. But it was sympathy tempered by the knowledge that his tears had been used as weapons against our parents' financial security for years. I can't lose everything, he whispered. You're not losing everything. You're losing the illusion that you can keep failing without consequences. So you won't help me? I looked around my small apartment, thinking about the life I'd built through careful planning and consistent effort. The emergency fund I'd accumulated through years of modest living. The investment portfolio that had grown because I'd chosen long-term security over short-term gratification. I'll help you, I said finally, but not the way you want me to. What do you mean? I mean, I'll help you develop a realistic plan for financial independence. I'll help you create a budget. I'll help you find steady employment. I'll help you learn to live within your means. That's not, I need money, Sarah. I need actual help. That is actual help. Everything else is just enabling. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was cold. You know what? I should have expected this from you. You've always been jealous of me, and now you're using my problems to get revenge. I'm not getting revenge, Marcus. I'm declining to participate in your financial irresponsibility. Mom and Dad are right about you. You are selfish. The accusation stung because it echoed my own fears about my decision to redirect funds to charity rather than keeping them for my own future. But it also clarified something important. Marcus genuinely believed that refusing to fund his lifestyle was an act of selfishness rather than an act of self-preservation. If taking care of your own financial future is selfish, I said, then I guess I'm selfish. Fine. But don't come crying to me when you need help someday. I won't need to. I replied. That's the point. After Marcus hung up, I sat in my kitchen with my coffee and thought about the conversation. The eviction notice and lease termination weren't just Marcus's problems, they were the natural consequences of decisions my entire family had made. Over the course of years, they'd taught him that his dreams were worth more than other people's security. They'd taught him that his immediate needs justified any sacrifice from others. They'd taught him that someone would always be there to catch him when he fell. Now he was learning what happened when the safety net finally broke, and in a few weeks, when my parents realized the full extent of their own financial vulnerability, they were going to learn the same lesson. 3 days after Marcus's panicked phone call, my parents invited me to lunch at the family restaurant where we'd celebrated every birthday and graduation for the past 15 years. The choice of venue wasn't accidental. They were trying to invoke nostalgia and family loyalty before making whatever requests they'd undoubtedly prepared. Mom looked tired in a way I'd never seen before, with dark circles under her eyes and a distracted manner that was completely unlike her usual composed demeanor. Dad seemed to have aged years in the weeks since our family dinner, his shoulders carrying a weight that made him appear smaller than I remembered. How are you doing, sweetheart? Mom asked, as we settled into our usual booth. We haven't heard from you since dinner at your place. I'm doing well, I replied honestly. Work is busy, and I've been researching some investment opportunities. Dad's eyes lit up with interest. Investment opportunities? That's smart thinking. It's never too early to start planning for the future. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. The man who had raided his daughter's education fund was giving me advice about financial planning. Actually, Mom said, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone approaching a delicate subject, we wanted to talk to you about Marcus's situation. What about it? He's going through a really difficult time right now, she continued. You know how hard it is to get a new business off the ground. He's facing some temporary setbacks, but we believe the food truck concept is still viable. I waited, letting them build their case before revealing how much I already knew. The thing is, Dad said, leaning forward with the earnest expression he used when he wanted to be persuasive, he needs some short-term financial support to get through this rough patch. Not a lot, just enough to catch up on some bills and keep the business operational. How much is not a lot? I asked. Mom and Dad exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that comes from 30 years of marriage and financial stress. About $10,000, Dad said finally. I almost choked on my water. $10,000 was more than Marcus had said he needed, and certainly more than my parents should have available, given what I knew about their financial situation. That's a substantial amount, I said carefully. It is, Mom agreed. And the truth is, We don't have that kind of liquid cash available right now. We'd have to liquidate some investments, maybe take out a home equity loan, or, Dad said, giving me the look that had always preceded requests for favors. We were hoping you might be able to help. We know you've been responsible with your money, and this would be a loan, not a gift. We'd pay you back with interest. I stared at them across the restaurant table, these two people who had raised me to believe that family obligations were sacred, while simultaneously teaching me that those obligations only flowed in one direction. They wanted me to fund their continued enabling of Marcus's financial irresponsibility, and they were asking me to do it in the same restaurant where they'd celebrated my academic achievements while never offering to contribute to my future. Let me make sure I understand, I said slowly. You want me to loan you $10,000 so you can give it to Marcus to bail him out of his latest business failure. It's not a failure, Mom said quickly. It's a learning experience. All entrepreneurs face setbacks. And you're planning to pay me back how exactly? Dad's confidence faltered slightly. Well, we'd work out a payment schedule. Maybe a few $100s a month. A few $100s a month, from parents who had just admitted they didn't have $10,000 in liquid savings. Parents who had systematically depleted their retirement accounts to fund their sons' fantasies. Parents who were now asking their daughter to loan them money they couldn't realistically pay back. What happens if Marcus's business fails completely? I asked. What happens if he can't pay you back, and you can't pay me back? That won't happen, Mom said, but her voice lacked conviction. It's happened 3 times before, I pointed out. What makes this different? Marcus is more mature now, Dad said. He's learned from his previous experiences. Has he? Because, from what I can see, the main thing he's learned is that someone will always bail him out when things go wrong. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with my parents becoming increasingly desperate and my responses becoming increasingly frank. They painted Marcus as a victim of circumstances beyond his control. They painted themselves as loving parents doing what any family would do. They painted me as the selfish daughter who had the resources to help but was choosing not to. Finally, Dad played what he clearly thought was his trump card. Sarah, we've always been proud of how independent and successful you are. But independence doesn't mean abandoning your family when they need you. You're right. I agreed. Independence doesn't mean abandoning family. But it also doesn't mean enabling destructive patterns or subsidizing poor decisions. We're not asking you to subsidize anything, Mom said. We're asking you to help your brother through a difficult time. No, I said, setting down my napkin with a finality that made them both sit back in their chairs. You're asking me to participate in the same cycle that got us to this point. Marcus makes poor decisions, faces consequences, and the family scrambles to protect him from those consequences. Then he makes more poor decisions because he's never learned to connect actions with outcomes. That's not fair, Dad said. What's not fair is expecting me to fund a pattern that's been devastating to this family's financial security for years. I leaned forward, meeting both of their gazes directly. Let me ask you something. When you gave Marcus my college fund, did you consider what would happen if his business failed? We believed in his potential, Mom said weakly. Did you have a backup plan for my education? They were silent. Did you consider that you might be jeopardizing your own retirement security by continuing to bail him out? More silence. Because the truth is, you're not just asking me to loan you $10,000. You're asking me to become complicit in a financial strategy that's already proven to be unsustainable. I gathered my purse and stood up, leaving money on the table for my untouched lunch. I love you both, I said, but I won't participate in enabling Marcus's irresponsibility any more than you already have. As I walked away from the table, I heard Mom call after me, Sarah, wait, we need to talk about this more. But I kept walking, because I'd already said everything that needed to be said. The conversation I'd really come to have would happen soon enough, when they realized exactly how precarious their own financial situation had become. That evening, I finalized the paperwork for my charitable donations, $25,000, to educational charities, designated specifically for students whose families couldn't afford college expenses. It was more than the amount that had been stolen from my education fund. It was enough to send several deserving students to college. And it was exactly the statement I'd been planning to make about the true value of education and the real meaning of family responsibility. That weekend, I threw myself into research. with the same methodical approach I'd used to build my investment portfolio. If I was going to make a statement about education and family responsibility, I wanted it to be as impactful and well executed as possible. I started with local educational charities, focusing on organizations that provided college scholarships to students from low-income families. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was researching aid for students in exactly the situation my parents had put me in, students whose families couldn't or wouldn't support their educational dreams. The first organization I investigated was the Metro Area Education Foundation, which had been providing scholarships to first-generation college students for over 20 years. Their website featured testimonials from recipients who had gone on to become teachers, nurses, engineers, and social workers, students who had transformed educational opportunities into meaningful careers. I called their development office and spoke with Maria Santos, the foundation's program director. She was enthusiastic about my interest in making a significant donation, but also refreshingly transparent about how the money would be used. We typically provide scholarships ranging from $2,000 to $5,000 per student, she explained. A donation of $25,000 could fund 5 full scholarships or 10 partial scholarships, depending on how you'd like to structure it. I'd like to fund full scholarships, I said, and I'd like them to be specifically designated for students whose families have withdrawn financial support. There was a pause on the other end of the line. That's very specific. May I ask what prompted that particular focus? Personal experience, I replied. I want to help students who've been put in impossible situations through no fault of their own. Maria's voice warmed considerably. We see that situation more often than you might think. Family financial crises, parents who change their priorities, students who are essentially abandoned when they most need support. It's heartbreaking, but it's also inspiring to see how resilient these young people can be. We arranged a meeting for the following Tuesday. I also scheduled appointments with 2 other educational charities, Scholars Without Borders, which focused on helping students complete their degrees despite financial hardships, and the Academic Achievement Fund, which provided both scholarships and mentoring support. Between meetings, I delved deeper into my parents' financial situation. What I discovered was even more alarming than I'd initially realized. Their retirement accounts, which should have been substantial after decades of contributing, had been systematically depleted over the past 5 years. The 401,000 accounts showed a pattern of early withdrawals, each carrying substantial penalties and tax implications. The amounts corresponded exactly with Marcus's various business ventures: 8,000 withdrawn when the dog treat company was failing, $12,000 for the vintage clothing store, $15,000 for initial food truck costs, and another $10,000 just 3 months ago, when the food truck started struggling. Their savings accounts were essentially empty. Their checking account showed they were living paycheck to paycheck despite both still working full-time. Most troubling of all, they'd taken out a home equity line of credit for $35,000, and they'd already used nearly half of it. They weren't just financially stressed, they were on the verge of financial ruin. And they had no idea that I knew. I also discovered something else in their financial records: email correspondence with a financial advisor who had been trying to warn them about their spending patterns for over 2 years. The advisor had repeatedly recommended that they stop funding Marcus's ventures and focus on rebuilding their retirement savings. They'd ignored every recommendation. One email from the advisor was particularly stark: at your current spending rate and with the early retirement withdrawals, you'll have insufficient funds for retirement by age 67. I strongly recommend reassessing your financial priorities and establishing boundaries around family financial support. My parents had never responded to that email. Tuesday's meetings with the charitable organizations confirmed what I'd hoped: my donation would make a real, immediate impact on deserving students. The Metro Area Education Foundation alone had a waiting list of over 100 qualified applicants who couldn't afford college without scholarship support. Your timing is perfect, Maria said as we concluded our meeting. We're preparing for our fall scholarship announcements, and we have several exceptional candidates who are exactly the kind of students you want to help. She showed me application files for students whose stories echoed my own experience in different ways. A young woman whose parents had spent her college fund on medical bills. A young man whose family had cut off support when he chose to study engineering instead of joining the family business. A student whose parents had divorced and each assumed the other would pay for college. These students have the academic qualifications and the drive to succeed, Maria explained. What they lack is family financial support. Your scholarships won't just pay for their education, they'll validate their worth and their dreams. That evening, I finalized my donation strategy. $25,000 split between 3 organizations, structured to fund 5 complete scholarships with preference given to students who had lost family financial support. The donations would be made publicly, with my name attached, ensuring that my family would eventually learn about them. But timing was everything. I needed to wait for the right moment, the moment when my parents were most desperate and most likely to appreciate the lesson I was teaching them. Based on their financial trajectory and Marcus's continued failures, that moment was coming soon. I spent the rest of the week preparing for the final phase of my plan. Legal documentation to ensure the donations were irrevocable. Communication strategies for when my family discovered what I'd done. And most importantly, clear boundaries for my own emotional protection when the inevitable confrontation occurred. My grandmother had believed in the power of education to transform lives. My parents had violated that belief when they stole my educational funds. I was about to honor it in a way that would teach them more about consequences than any lecture or argument ever could. The students who would receive these scholarships would get the support that had been taken from me, and my family would learn that actions have consequences, especially when those consequences come from the people they'd taken for granted. By Thursday, I had made my final decisions about the charitable donations. The process had been more emotionally complex than I'd anticipated. Reading through scholarship applications from students whose families had failed them brought back all the hurt and betrayal I'd been trying to channel into something positive. The Metro Area Education Foundation would receive $15,000, enough to fund 3 complete scholarships. Maria had already identified the recipients: Jennifer, whose parents had spent her college fund on her father's gambling debts; David, whose family had cut off support when he came out as gay; and Ashley, whose mother had remarried and decided her new husband's children were more deserving of educational support. Scholars Without Borders would receive $7,000 to fund emergency assistance for students already in college who had lost family support mid-semester. Their program director had explained that this was often the most devastating scenario: students who had to drop out in their junior or senior year because family circumstances changed. The Academic Achievement Fund would receive $3,000 for their mentoring program, which paired scholarship recipients with professional mentors who could provide the kind of guidance and support that families typically offered. But I wanted to do something more personal, something that would directly honor my grandmother's memory while making my point unmistakably clear. So I established one additional scholarship fund, the Ruth Mitchell Educational Trust, designed specifically for students whose designated education funds had been diverted to other family members. Setting up the trust required meetings with attorneys, financial advisors, and the local community foundation that would administer it. The legal structure was complex but straightforward: an irrevocable trust funded with $25,000 from my investment portfolio, designed to provide annual scholarships in perpetuity. The trust documents were deliberately detailed about its purpose and inspiration. The official description read, "The Ruth Mitchell Educational Trust honors the memory of Ruth Mitchell, who believed that funds designated for education should be protected and used solely for their intended purpose. This trust provides scholarships to students whose educational opportunities have been compromised by family financial decisions that diverted designated education funds to other purposes." I knew my parents would eventually read those words. I knew they would understand exactly what had inspired the trust's creation. And I knew they would realize that their actions had not only stolen my educational opportunity but had created a permanent reminder of their betrayal that would help other students for decades to come. The Community Foundation's president, Dr. Elizabeth Carter, was intrigued by the trust's specific focus. "This is quite unique," she said during our final meeting. "Most educational trusts are broader in scope. What made you choose this particular criterion?" "Experience," I replied. "I've seen what happens when families make short-term financial decisions that compromise long-term educational goals. I want to help students who find themselves in that situation through no fault of their own." Dr. Carter nodded thoughtfully. "We see this more often than we'd like. Families who view education funds as emergency accounts rather than protected investments in their children's futures. Your trust will fill a real need. We discuss the scholarship selection criteria in detail. Recipients would need to demonstrate academic merit and financial need, but the primary requirement would be evidence that designated education funds had been redirected by family members for other purposes. The scholarship would cover full tuition and FEs for qualifying students, with preference given to those pursuing degrees in fields that demonstrated a commitment to public service. One question, Dr. Carter said as we reviewed the final documents. Would you like the scholarships to be announced publicly? Many donors prefer anonymity, but given the specific nature of this trust, public recognition might amplify its impact. I considered this carefully. Public announcements would ensure my family learned about the trust quickly. They would also create a permanent public record of my response to their betrayal, but they would also help other families understand the long-term consequences of misusing education funds. Yes, I said finally. I want the scholarships to be announced publicly. I want the trust's mission to be clearly communicated. Dr. Carter smiled. I think your grandmother would be proud of this legacy. That evening, I completed all the financial transfers. $25,000 moved from my investment account to the Ruth Mitchell Educational Trust. Another $25,000 distributed among the 3 established charities. $50,000 total, nearly twice the amount that had been stolen from my education fund. The transfers were irrevocable. The money was gone from my personal accounts forever, redirected to serve students who needed exactly the kind of support my family had denied me. In purely financial terms, I had just given away enough money to pay for law school twice over, but in emotional terms, I had just transformed my family's betrayal into something meaningful and lasting. Instead of letting their actions destroy my faith in education and family responsibility, I had used those same actions to create opportunities for students who deserved better. I printed copies of all the donation receipts and trust documents, organizing them in a folder that I placed in my desk drawer. Soon enough, I would need those documents for the conversation that was coming. Marcus's business was failing faster than even I had anticipated. My parents' financial situation was deteriorating weekly. Their desperation was growing, and their assumptions about my willingness to rescue them were about to be tested in ways they couldn't imagine. The irony was perfect. They had taught me that family money could be redirected without consultation when someone else's needs seemed more pressing. I had learned that lesson well. Soon, they would discover exactly how well I had learned it. My phone buzzed with a text message from Mom. Hi honey, hope you're doing well. Dad and I would love to take you to dinner this weekend to talk about some family matters. Let us know when you're free. I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, this weekend works. I have some family matters to discuss too. The final act was about to begin. Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that had always been my favorite, but I felt none of the usual seasonal optimism as I drove to meet my parents at Romano's, the upscale Italian restaurant they'd chosen for our family discussion. The choice of venue told me everything I needed to know about their strategy. They were hoping the elegant atmosphere would soften whatever resistance I might have to their latest request. I arrived 15 minutes early and requested a corner table where our conversation would be relatively private. I'd brought a small folder containing copies of my charitable donation receipts, the trust documents, and my grandmother's original will. Everything was organized and ready, though I suspected I wouldn't need to reference the documents directly. The conversation itself would provide all the context necessary. My parents arrived exactly on time, both dressed more formally than usual and wearing the kind of forced smiles that suggested they'd been preparing for this conversation all week. Mom had chosen her favorite dress, the navy blue one she wore to important occasions, and Dad was wearing the tie I'd given him for Father's Day 3 years ago. They were pulling out all the emotional manipulation stops. Sarah, darling, you look wonderful, Mom said, enveloping me in a hug that lasted a few seconds longer than normal. We've been so looking forward to this. Dad kissed my cheek and squeezed my shoulder. It's been too long since we've had a real family dinner together. Just the 3 of us. The absence of Marcus from this gathering was notable and strategic. They'd clearly decided that their chances of success were better without their financially desperate son sitting at the table, reminding me of exactly where their previous family investments had led. We ordered drinks and made small talk about work, the weather, and neighborhood gossip, but I could see the tension in both of their faces. Mom kept fidgeting with her napkin, and Dad was using his overly jovial voice that always emerged when he was nervous about something. Finally, after the appetizers arrived, Dad cleared his throat and adopted his serious conversation expression. Sarah, your mother and I wanted to talk to you about something important, something that affects the whole family. I figured as much, I replied, taking a sip of my wine. What's on your minds? Mom leaned forward with the earnest expression she'd perfected over years of parent-teacher conferences and difficult family discussions. We've been thinking a lot about family finances lately, and we've realized we need to be more strategic about how we handle money as a family unit. That sounds wise, I agreed. Financial planning is important. The thing is, Dad continued, we've discovered that our approach to supporting Marcus might not have been as effective as we'd hoped. This was new. I'd expected them to ask for money to bail out Marcus again, not to admit that their strategy had been flawed. What do you mean? I asked. Well, Mom said, glancing at Dad for support, we've been looking at the numbers, and we realize that maybe we've been too generous. Maybe we haven't been helping Marcus develop the kind of independence he needs. Dad nodded gravely. We've been talking to a financial advisor, and she's helped us understand that our retirement security has been compromised by some of the decisions we've made. I felt a flicker of surprise. They were actually acknowledging the problem. After years of denial and rationalization, they were finally confronting the reality of their financial situation. That must have been difficult to realize, I said carefully. It was, Mom admitted, but we're ready to make changes. We're ready to establish better boundaries and focus on long-term financial health for everyone in the family. That's good to hear. Dad leaned back slightly, and I could see him shifting into his persuasive mode. The challenge is that we need some help transitioning to this new approach. Marcus is in a difficult situation right now, and we can't just abandon him completely. But we also can't keep depleting our retirement savings. And there it was. The real reason for this dinner, dressed up in the language of fiscal responsibility and family unity. So what are you thinking? I asked. We were hoping, Mom said, her voice taking on the wheedling tone she'd used when I was a teenager, and she wanted me to babysit Marcus, that you might be willing to help us help him one final time. Not as a bailout, but as a transition loan that would give him time to find steady employment while we establish our new boundaries. How much money are we talking about? $15,000, Dad said quickly, as if saying it fast would make it seem smaller. It would cover his immediate debts and give him a cushion while he looks for a regular job. $15,000, more than half of what they'd stolen from my education fund, presented as a transition loan that we all knew would never be repaid. And this would be the last time you'd ask me to help with Marcus's financial problems? I asked. Absolutely, Mom said with the kind of emphatic sincerity that suggested she actually believed what she was saying. This would give us the chance to reset our family financial dynamics and establish healthier patterns going forward. I looked at both of them across the table. These two people who had raised me with lectures about responsibility and consequences while simultaneously teaching me that both of those concepts were negotiable when applied to their favorite child. They genuinely believed that their new awareness of the problem somehow obligated me to fund the solution. Let me ask you something, I said, setting down my fork and giving them my full attention. If I give you $15,000, and Marcus defaults on paying it back, what happens then? He won't default, Dad said quickly. But if he does, then we'd be responsible for paying you back, Mom said. With what money? You just told me that your retirement savings have been compromised and you're working with a financial advisor to establish better boundaries. They exchanged glances, and I could see them realizing that I was asking questions they hadn't considered. We'd figure it out, Dad said weakly. The way you figured out how to fund Marcus's previous business ventures. Without touching my college fund? The silence that followed was thick with tension. Mom's face flushed, and Dad's jaw tightened in the way it always did when he was preparing to be defensive. Sarah, Mom said carefully, I understand you're still upset about the education fund, but we've explained our reasoning for that decision. Yes, you have. You explained that you believed Marcus needed the money more than I did, and that you trusted me to find another way to pay for law school. That's right, Dad said, looking relieved that I seemed to be acknowledging their logic. Well, I said, reaching for my folder, I've found another way. What do you mean? Mom asked. I smiled at them with the same bright confidence they'd used. when explaining why my college fund had been redirected to Marcus's food truck dream. I mean, I've learned from your example about family financial management. I've discovered the beauty of redirecting funds from their intended purpose when someone else's needs seem more pressing. I don't understand, Dad said. You will, I replied, opening my folder, because I'm about to show you exactly how well I've learned the lessons you taught me about family priorities and financial responsibility. I pulled the first set of documents from my folder and placed them on the table between us. Bank statements showing my investment portfolio balance as of 1 week ago, 180 to 47. The silence that followed was profound. I watched my parents' faces as they processed the numbers, saw their assumptions about my financial situation crumble in real time. Sarah, Mom whispered, what is this? This is my actual financial situation, I replied calmly. The portfolio I've been building since college, through careful investing and living below my means. Dad picked up the statements, his hands shaking slightly. You have nearly $200,000? I did. Last week. Did? Mom's voice was sharp with alarm. I reached into the folder again and pulled out a second set of documents. These are donation receipts from various educational charities. As you can see, I've recently made some significant charitable contributions. Dad's face went pale as he scanned the receipts. $50,000? Sarah, what have you done? I've followed your example, I said simply. I've redirected funds from their intended purpose, my future security, to help people whose educational opportunities have been compromised by family financial decisions. Mom snatched the papers from Dad's hands, her eyes growing wider as she read. The Ruth Mitchell Educational Trust. You named it after Grandma? I did. It seemed appropriate, given that the trust is specifically designed to help students whose designated education funds have been diverted to other family members. The restaurant noise faded into background as my parents sat in stunned silence, processing the implications of what I'd just revealed. Finally, Dad found his voice. You gave away $50,000 out of spite? Not out of spite, I corrected. Out of principle. The same principle you used when you gave Marcus my college fund. You taught me that family money can be redirected without consultation when someone else's needs seem more pressing. That's completely different, Mom said, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and glanced around the restaurant. How is it different? Because we were trying to help your brother succeed, and I'm helping students succeed whose families have failed them the way you failed me. Dad leaned forward, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been panic. Sarah, you can't just throw away your future like this. That money was supposed to be for your retirement, your security, the way my college fund was supposed to be for my education. We always planned to help you with law school eventually, Mom said desperately. We just needed to get Marcus stabilized first. I pulled out the third set of documents, copies of their financial statements that I'd accessed through the accounts they'd never removed me from. With what money? I asked, placing their bank statements next to mine. Your checking account has less than $3,000. Your savings are essentially empty. You've withdrawn nearly $60,000 from your retirement accounts in the past 5 years, and you've used half of your home equity line of credit. Dad's face went from flushed to ashen. How did you? Where did you get these? You gave me access to these accounts years ago and never revoked it, just like you never asked my permission before taking my college fund. Mom's hands were trembling as she reached for her wine glass. You had no right to look at our private financial information, and you had no right to take money that my grandmother specifically designated for my education. But we both did what we thought was necessary, didn't we? The accusation hung in the air between us. Dad was staring at the financial statements like they contained his death sentence, which, in a way, they did. Their financial future was far more precarious than they'd admitted to themselves, let alone to me. Sarah, Dad said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, if you know how bad our situation is, how can you sit there and tell us you've given away money that could help your own family? Because you're not my family, I said quietly. Not in any way that matters. Mom's gasp was audible. How can you say that? Because family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't lie to each other. Family doesn't sacrifice one child's future for another child's fantasies. We never meant to hurt you, Mom said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. But you did hurt me. And more than that, you taught me that my dreams were less important than Marcus's. that my hard work was less valuable than his potential, that my future was expendable as long as his was protected. I gathered the documents and returned them to my folder, my hand steady despite the emotional magnitude of the conversation. So I decided to honor the values you actually demonstrated, rather than the ones you claim to believe in. You showed me that family money belongs to whoever needs it most. Well, those scholarship recipients needed educational support more than I needed retirement security. Dad's voice was hoarse with desperation. Sarah, please. We made mistakes, but we can fix this. We can work together as a family to solve everyone's problems. No, we can't, because you still don't understand what the problem actually is. Then, explain it to us, Mom pleaded. I looked at both of them, these two people who had shaped my childhood and taught me so much about life, love, and the terrible ways that families could fail each other. The problem isn't that you don't have enough money. The problem is that you've never learned to connect actions with consequences. Marcus fails, and you rescue him. You make poor financial decisions, and you expect me to rescue you. You violate trust, and you expect forgiveness without accountability. I stood up, leaving money on the table for my meal. The $50,000 I donated will help students whose families have taught them the same lesson you taught me, that their dreams don't matter as much as someone else's needs. The difference is, these students will get the support they deserve. Where does that leave us? Dad asked, his voice breaking. I looked down at them, sitting in their formal clothes at their carefully chosen restaurant, surrounded by the wreckage of their assumptions about family loyalty and financial security. It leaves you exactly where your decisions have led you, I said, learning to live with the consequences of your choices, just like I've had to do. As I walked away from the table, I heard Mom calling my name, but I didn't turn around. I'd said everything that needed to be said, and I'd done everything that needed to be done. The money was gone, redirected to students who would use educational opportunities to build better lives. My family's illusions about my willingness to enable their dysfunction were gone too. For the first time in years, I felt completely free. 3 days after the restaurant confrontation, I received a call from Dr. Elizabeth Carter at the Community Foundation. Her voice bubbled with excitement as she delivered news I'd been anticipating. Sarah, I wanted to let you know that the Ruth Mitchell Educational Trust has been approved and will be officially announced in tomorrow's community newsletter. The response from our board has been overwhelmingly positive. They're calling it one of the most thoughtfully structured educational funds they've ever seen. That's wonderful to hear, I replied, though I felt a flutter of nervous anticipation. Once the announcement was public, there would be no taking any of this back. We've also received approval to feature the trust in next month's donor spotlight in the regional newspaper. Would you be willing to participate in a brief interview about your motivation for establishing the fund? I considered this carefully. A newspaper interview would ensure my parents learned about the trust immediately, and it would create a permanent public record of both my charitable giving and the specific circumstances that had inspired it. Yes, I said finally. I think it's important for people to understand why educational funds need to be protected. The interview was scheduled for the following week, but the community newsletter was published every Wednesday and distributed to over 15,000 households in our area. I knew my parents subscribed. Mom had been reading it religiously for years, always interested in local news and social events. Wednesday afternoon, my phone started ringing. The first call was from Marcus, and his voice was a mixture of confusion and accusation. Sarah, what the hell is this trust thing? Mom just called me crying about some newspaper article. It's exactly what it sounds like, I replied calmly. An educational trust established in Grandma's memory to help students whose families have redirected their education funds. You're doing this to punish us, aren't you? This is all about the college fund. This is about honoring Grandma's values and helping students who deserve support. $50,000, Sarah? Do you have any idea what that money could have done for this family? The question was so perfectly illustrative of everything wrong with his thinking that I almost laughed. Yes, Marcus. It could have enabled more poor decisions and delayed the inevitable consequences of financial irresponsibility. Instead, it's going to send deserving students to college. You're unbelievable. Mom and Dad are devastated. They'll recover. Unlike the students who won't get college degrees because their families made selfish choices. Marcus hung up on me, but my phone rang again within minutes. This time it was my mother, and she was indeed crying. Sarah, please tell me this is some kind of mistake. The trust announcement, it says the fund is for students whose education money was given to family members. Everyone will know it's about us. The trust is about honoring grandma's belief in education, I said. If people draw connections to other situations, that's not my responsibility. But the community will think we're terrible parents. The community will think whatever the facts suggest they should think. Sarah, please, can't we work this out as a family? Can't you cancel the trust and we'll figure out a better solution? The trust is irrevocable, Mom. The money has been transferred permanently, just like what you did with my college fund. There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was small and defeated. What do you want from us? I don't want anything from you. I want you to learn to live with the consequences of your decisions without expecting me to rescue you. The conversation ended with more tears from Mom and promises that they would make this right somehow, though neither of us knew what that could possibly mean at this point. The newspaper interview took place the following Tuesday at a coffee shop downtown. The reporter, Janet Morrison, was a middle-aged woman with a warm demeanor and sharp questions that told me she'd done her homework. The Ruth Mitchell Educational Trust has a very specific focus, she began. Can you tell me what inspired such a targeted approach to educational philanthropy? My grandmother believed that money designated for education should be sacred, I replied. She felt that when families divert education funds to other purposes, they're not just taking away financial support, they're sending a message that education isn't valuable enough to protect. The trust specifically helps students whose education funds have been redirected to family members. That's quite specific. Is there a personal story behind this criteria? I'd prepared for this question. I've seen how devastating it can be when families treat education funds as emergency accounts rather than protected investments in their children's futures. Students in these situations often feel abandoned by the people who should be their strongest advocates. What kind of impact do you hope the trust will have? I hope it sends a message that education has intrinsic value that transcends family financial emergencies. I hope it helps students understand that their dreams are worth protecting, even when their families don't protect them. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, covering the mechanics of the trust, the scholarship selection process, and my broader philosophy about educational philanthropy. Janet was professional and thorough, and I could tell she understood the deeper story I was telling without requiring me to spell it out explicitly. One final question, she said as we concluded. The trust is named after Ruth Mitchell. Can you tell me about her? She was my grandmother, and she understood something that many families forget, that investing in education is investing in someone's entire future. She believed that when you promise to support someone's education, that promise should be honored, regardless of other circumstances that might arise. The article was published the following Sunday in the lifestyle section, complete with a photo of me and details about the trust's mission and funding. The headline read, "Local woman establishes trust to protect student dreams from family financial decisions." By Sunday afternoon, my phone was ringing constantly. Extended family members who'd seen the article, family friends who were concerned about the family rift, and dozens of people expressing support for the trust's mission. But the most important call came that evening from Maria Santos at the Metro Area Education Foundation. Sarah, I wanted to personally thank you. We've already received calls from 3 other families interested in establishing similar trusts after reading about yours in the paper. Your story is inspiring people to think differently about protecting educational opportunities. As I hung up the phone, I realized that the trust had accomplished something I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just helping the students who would receive scholarships, it was starting conversations about family financial responsibility and the value of educational commitments. My parents had taught me an unintended lesson about the power of consequences. Now I was teaching that same lesson to others, one scholarship at a time. The newspaper article unleashed a flood of reactions that continued for weeks. My phone became a constant source of drama as various family members, family friends, and community members weighed in on what they perceived as either an inspiring act of philanthropy or a cruel public humiliation of my parents. Uncle Jim, my father's brother, called on Monday morning with the kind of righteous anger that suggested he'd been designated as the family spokesman. Sarah, what you've done to your parents is unconscionable. They raised you, fed you, clothed you, and this is how you repay them. By publicly embarrassing them and throwing away money that could help the family? Uncle Jim, I appreciate your concern, But this situation is between me and my parents. The hell it is. You've made it public by putting it in the newspaper. Do you have any idea how humiliated they are? Your mother cried for 3 hours after reading that article. My mother cried when Marcus's businesses failed too, but that didn't stop her from funding the next one. That's different. Marcus is family. So am I, supposedly. But somehow that didn't protect my college fund. Uncle Jim's voice took on the patronizing tone that had always irritated me. Sarah, you're a smart girl, but you're being petty. Families help each other through difficult times. You're right. Families do help each other, but they also protect each other's futures and honor their commitments. My parents did neither. The conversation devolved into a lecture about family loyalty, forgiveness, and the importance of maintaining relationships regardless of disagreements. Uncle Jim seemed genuinely unable to understand that there was a difference between forgiveness and enabling. My cousin Lisa called later that week with a different perspective. Sarah, I read the article, and honestly, good for you. I've watched Marcus coast on family money for years while you worked your ass off for everything you achieved. Thank you. That means a lot, but I have to ask, are you sure you want to burn bridges like this? I mean, they're still your parents. The bridges were burned when they stole my education fund. I'm just declining to rebuild them on their terms. Lisa was quiet for a moment. I get it. I really do. But this is going to have consequences for family relationships that go way beyond just you and your parents. She was right. The trust and the newspaper article had created fractures throughout our extended family. People were choosing sides, and those choices were revealing long-hidden opinions about favoritism, financial responsibility, and family dynamics. My father's sister, Aunt Margaret, sent a scathing email accusing me of weaponizing charity and destroying family unity for personal vindication. She'd always been Marcus's biggest supporter outside our immediate family, constantly praising his creative spirit and entrepreneurial vision while dismissing my achievements as just good grades. But my mother's sister, Aunt Carol, surprised me with a supportive phone call. I've been watching this family dynamic for 20 years, she said, and I've been waiting for someone to call out the favoritism. Your parents have always treated Marcus like he could do no wrong. And you should be grateful for whatever attention you received. I didn't know other people noticed. Oh honey, everyone noticed. We just didn't know how to address it without causing family drama. But you've forced the conversation, and maybe that's what this family needed. The most painful call came from my grandmother's best friend, Mrs. Patterson, who was 91 and had known our family for over 40 years. Sarah dear, I read about your trust in the paper, and I wanted you to know that Ruth would be so proud of you. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. That means everything to me. I remember when she set up your college fund. She was so worried about how your parents treated you differently than Marcus. She used to say that you had twice the character but got half the recognition. The conversation left me in tears, both for the validation it provided and for the grief it triggered. My grandmother had seen the family dynamics clearly, and she'd tried to protect me in the only way she could. But the most devastating reaction came in a series of text messages from Marcus that arrived over the course of several days. Hope you're happy. Mom hasn't stopped crying since the article came out. Dad's blood pressure is through the roof. Doctor says he needs to reduce stress. Thanks for making our family the talk of the neighborhood. Everyone knows we're the family that stole from their daughter now. You've destroyed everything for a bunch of strangers. I hope those scholarship kids appreciate what you've done to your own family for them. I didn't respond to any of the messages, but they accomplished what Marcus intended. They made me question whether my actions had been justified or simply vindictive. Late at night, lying in bed, I found myself wondering if there had been a better way to handle the situation. But then I would remember the feeling of discovering that my college fund was gone. I would remember the casual way my parents had announced their decision, as if my dreams were naturally less important than Marcus's fantasies. I would remember years of being expected to be understanding, flexible, and grateful for less. And I would remember the scholarship recipients whose lives would be changed by the trust. Jennifer, whose parents had gambled away her college fund. David, whose family had abandoned him for being gay. Ashley, whose mother had decided that stepchildren were more deserving of educational support. The trust wasn't about punishing my family, it was about honoring my grandmother's values and protecting students who were as powerless as I had been. If my family felt humiliated by the public attention, perhaps they should consider why their actions couldn't withstand public scrutiny. 3 weeks after the article was published, I received a handwritten letter from my mother. The envelope was addressed in her careful script, and the letter inside was 2 pages of heartbreak and desperation. Dear Sarah, it began, I don't know how to reach you anymore. You won't take our calls, and when you do talk to us, you sound like you're speaking to strangers. I know we made mistakes with the college fund. I know we haven't always treated you and Marcus equally, but we love you, and we're willing to do whatever it takes to fix this. The letter went on to detail their financial struggles, their fears about retirement, and their growing understanding of how their decisions had affected me. It ended with a plea, please come home so we can work this out as a family. Please, don't let this destroy everything we've built together. I read the letter 3 times, then placed it in my desk drawer next to the trust documents. My mother's pain was real, but so was the pattern of behavior that had created this situation. Love without accountability wasn't love, it was enablement, and I was done being enabled just as surely as I was done enabling others. A month after the newspaper article, I received an unexpected call from Jennifer Martinez, the attorney who had helped me understand my legal options regarding my grandmother's will. Sarah, I've been following the coverage of your educational trust, and I wanted to check in with you about some developments you should be aware of. What kind of developments? Well, your story has generated more interest than you might realize. I've had 3 families contact me in the past 2 weeks asking about their legal rights when designated education funds have been misappropriated by relatives. I sat down heavily in my desk chair. Really? Really? And here's the thing too. Of those cases have much stronger legal grounds than yours did. One involves a grandmother who specifically prohibited the use of education funds for any other purpose, and the family violated that directive. Another involves a trust fund that was legally restricted to educational expenses. Jennifer explained that my public discussion of the issue had educated other families about their rights and options. People who had quietly accepted the loss of education funds were now understanding that they might have legal recourse. There's something else, she continued. I've been contacted by a reporter from the state newspaper who's working on a larger story about families misappropriating education funds. Apparently, your trust announcement has opened the door to a much bigger conversation. The implications were staggering. What had started as my personal response to family betrayal was becoming a catalyst for broader awareness about educational financial abuse. Has my family contacted you? I asked. No, but I suspect they may eventually. The legal exposure from their actions is significant, especially given the documented violation of your grandmother's explicit instructions. That afternoon, I received a call that confirmed Jennifer's prediction. It was my father, and his voice carried a strain I'd never heard before. Sarah, we need to talk. Not about money, not about the trust, about legal issues. What legal issues? We've been advised to consult with an attorney about the college fund situation, about Grandma's will and the specific language regarding the education fund. I felt a cold certainty settle in my stomach. Who advised you to do that? Uncle Jim talked to his lawyer friend, and apparently there might be complications related to how we handled the fund. What kind of complications? Dad's voice was barely above a whisper, the kind that could involve lawsuits and financial penalties. The conversation that followed was surreal. My parents had finally consulted legal counsel and discovered what I'd known for months, that their appropriation of my education fund had violated the explicit terms of my grandmother's will and could constitute a form of financial fraud. The lawyer says we could be required to pay back the full amount plus interest and penalties, Dad said. But more than that, there could be criminal charges if you decided to pursue them. Are you asking me not to pursue legal action? I'm asking you to help us understand what your intentions are. The lawyer says we need to know whether you're planning to file a lawsuit. I looked around my apartment, at the life I'd built through my own efforts, at the evidence of the financial independence I'd achieved without family support. The power dynamic had shifted completely. For the first time in my life, my parents needed something from me more than I needed anything from them. I have no current plans to pursue legal action, I said finally, but I also won't make any promises about the future. What does that mean? It means that if you continue to harass me about the trust, if you keep trying to manipulate family members into pressuring me, if you make my life difficult in any way, I'll reconsider my options. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. Sarah, Are you threatening us? I'm establishing boundaries. The same way you established your priorities when you took my college fund. A week later, I learned about additional consequences I hadn't anticipated. Marcus called, and for the first time in years, he sounded genuinely defeated rather than entitled. Sarah, I need you to know what's happening. The food truck business is completely finished. But worse than that, I can't get anyone to hire me. What do you mean? Everyone in town knows about the family situation now. When I apply for jobs, they Google my name and find articles about the trust and about families who steal education funds. They assume I'm unreliable. Are you? That's not the point. The point is that your little publicity stunt has made me unemployable in the city. I felt a flicker of sympathy, but it was tempered by the knowledge that Marcus had never seriously pursued steady employment before. The newspaper coverage might have made job hunting more difficult, but it hadn't created his pattern of avoiding regular work. Marcus, you've been unemployable for years. The difference is that now potential employers have documentation of your work history instead of just having to guess. So this is my fault? Your employment situation is the result of your employment choices. The newspaper coverage is the result of our family's financial choices. I'm thinking about moving to another city. Starting over somewhere people don't know about this mess. That might be good for you. A fresh start with no family safety net might teach you some valuable lessons about self-sufficiency. Marcus hung up without saying goodbye, but his call had revealed something important. The social consequences of my actions were extending beyond my immediate family. The trust had created a public record of financial dysfunction that would follow them for years. I should have felt guilty about this, but instead I felt a strange sense of justice. For years, my family's poor decisions had been hidden behind closed doors while I bore the private consequences of their choices. Now their decisions were public, and they were experiencing the social accountability that had always been missing from their financial decision-making. The most surprising development came 2 weeks later when Dr. Carter from the Community Foundation called with an update. Sarah, I wanted to let you know that your trust has inspired a wave of similar funds. We've established 3 additional educational trusts in the past month, all focused on protecting students from family financial misappropriation. The legal framework you helped create is being replicated across the state. That's wonderful news, but there's something else. We've been contacted by the state attorney general's office. They're investigating patterns of educational fund misappropriation and want to use your trust as a model for legislative recommendations. Legislative recommendations? They're considering proposing laws that would provide stronger legal protections for designated education funds. Your situation, and the legal research that supported your trust, has become a case study for potential policy changes. I hung up the phone with a sense of awe. What had started as a personal response to family betrayal was becoming a catalyst for systemic change. Students across the state would have better legal protections because of the trust I'd established in my grandmother's memory. That evening, I received one final call that crystallized the full scope of what had happened. It was Mrs. Patterson, my grandmother's elderly friend. Sarah dear, I just wanted you to know that Ruth's story is being told all over town. People are talking about how she tried to protect you and how you honored her memory. She would be so proud that her struggle to safeguard your future has ended up protecting other children too. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the complex web of consequences that had emerged from my decision to establish the trust. My family was facing legal exposure, social scrutiny, and financial reality. Marcus was being forced to confront his employment history. My parents were learning what it felt like to have their private decisions become public knowledge, but students were also getting scholarships. Families were learning about their legal rights. Policymakers were considering stronger protections for educational funds. The consequences of my actions had rippled far beyond what I'd intended, creating accountability and awareness in ways I'd never imagined. My grandmother's belief in the power of education was being validated on a scale she never could have envisioned. Justice, I realized, wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was about transformation. The ceremony was held at the state capitol, with representatives from dozens of educational organizations and over 100 scholarship recipients in attendance. As I stood at the podium, looking out at young faces filled with hope and determination, I thought about my grandmother and the chain of events she had set in motion by designating my college fund. Education is not just about acquiring knowledge, I said to the audience. It's about someone believing in your potential enough to invest. in your future. When families violate that trust, they're not just taking money, they're communicating that your dreams are expendable. I paused, thinking about Jennifer, David, Ashley, and all the other students whose families had failed them. But here's what I've learned: when one family fails you, sometimes you can create a new kind of family, a community of people who understand the value of education and the importance of protecting opportunities for others. These scholarship funds represent more than financial support. They represent a promise that your dreams matter, even when the people who should protect them choose not to. As I concluded my remarks, I saw tears in many of the faces looking back at me. These were students who understood betrayal, abandonment, and the crushing weight of having their futures deemed expendable by the people who should have protected them. But they were also students who had been given second chances, who would graduate debt-free, who would carry forward the lesson that education should be protected and valued. Walking back to my car after the ceremony, I realized that my family's betrayal had been transformed into something larger than any of us had imagined. What had started as personal pain had become systemic change. What had begun as individual injustice had evolved into collective protection for future students. My grandmother's belief in the power of education lived on, magnified beyond anything she could have envisioned. And I was finally ready to build my own future, grounded in the principles she had taught me but free from the family dynamics that had nearly derailed my dreams. 1 year after establishing the Ruth Mitchell Educational Trust, I received a letter that made everything come full circle. It was handwritten on university letterhead, and the return address showed it was from Jennifer Chen, the first scholarship recipient whose college fund had been stolen by her father's gambling addiction. Dear Miss Mitchell, the letter began. I wanted to write to tell you that I just received my acceptance to medical school. When my family took my college fund 2 years ago, I thought my dreams of becoming a doctor were over. Your scholarship didn't just pay for my undergraduate degree, it restored my belief that someone could value my future more than my family did. I sat in my apartment, now filled with law school textbooks and case studies, and read Jennifer's letter 3 times. She had included a photo of herself in a white coat at a medical school orientation, smiling with the kind of confidence that comes from earning your achievements rather than having them handed to you. I've enclosed a small check. The letter continued. It's not much, just 500, but I want to contribute to the trust that changed my life. I know what it feels like to have your education threatened by family dysfunction, and I want to help other students who find themselves in that impossible situation. The check was made out to the Ruth Mitchell Educational Trust, and in the memo line Jennifer had written, paying it forward with gratitude. I called Dr. Carter at the Community Foundation to arrange the deposit and learned that Jennifer wasn't the only scholarship recipient who had chosen to give back. 3 other students had made donations to the trust, creating a self-sustaining cycle of educational support. The trust has become something beyond what any of us imagine, Dr. Carter said. It's not just providing scholarships, it's creating a community of students who understand the value of protecting educational opportunities for others. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery where my grandmother was buried. I'd avoided visiting her grave for months, too angry about my family's betrayal to face the sadness of her absence. But sitting in my car in the peaceful cemetery, I finally felt ready to have the conversation I'd been postponing. Grandma Ruth, I said quietly, placing Jennifer's letter on her headstone, I hope you can see what your education fund became. It was stolen from me, just like you were afraid it would be. But somehow, that theft led to something bigger than either of us could have imagined. I told her about the trust, the scholarship recipients, the policy changes, and the ripple effects that had spread across the state. I told her about my law school acceptance and my plans to specialize in family law, helping other people navigate the complex emotional and legal terrain of family financial abuse. The money you saved for my education is still being used for education, I continued. Just not the way any of us planned. But I think you'd be proud of how it turned out. As I prepared to leave, I noticed someone approaching from across the cemetery. It was my mother, carrying a small bouquet of flowers, the same yellow roses that had been Grandma's favorites. I hope you don't mind, Mom said quietly. I come here sometimes to talk to her about what we did wrong and what we're trying to do better. You don't need my permission to visit your own mother's grave, I know, but I didn't want to intrude on your time with her. We stood together in awkward silence for a few moments, both of us processing the complex emotions of grief, regret, and tentative reconciliation. Sarah, Mom said finally, I've been going to counseling since this all happened. Individual counseling, not just the financial planning. That's good. I've learned some things about myself that are hard to face. About why I enabled Marcus. And why I minimized your achievements. About how I use family loyalty as an excuse for poor decision making. I looked at her, this woman who had raised me with such contradictory messages about love, responsibility, and self-worth. What did you learn? I learned that I was terrified of Marcus failing because I thought his failures would reflect on my parenting. So I kept rescuing him, which prevented him from learning to rescue himself. And I took your strength for granted because it was easier than admitting I wasn't being fair to you. And now I'm learning to let Marcus face his own consequences, while offering emotional support instead of financial bailouts. And I'm learning to appreciate your achievements instead of assuming they don't require family celebration. Mom placed her flowers next to my grandmother's headstone, then turned to face me directly. I know I can't undo what we did. I know the trust money represents not just financial loss, but emotional betrayal. But I want you to know that watching you handle this situation has taught me more about integrity than I learned in 58 years of life before it. Thank you for saying that. Is there any possibility that we could have a relationship going forward? Not the old relationship based on me expecting you to accept whatever treatment we decided to give you, but a new relationship based on mutual respect. I considered her question while looking at my grandmother's grave, thinking about forgiveness, accountability, and the possibility of redemption. I think so, I said finally, but it has to be a relationship between equals. I won't be the family backup plan anymore, and I won't pretend that what happened wasn't significant. I understand. And Sarah, your grandmother would be so proud of what you've accomplished. Not just the trust and the scholarships, but the way you've transformed something painful into something meaningful. 6 months later, I received an invitation that brought the entire experience to a meaningful conclusion. The State Educational Protection Act had been signed into law, and they were holding a ceremony to honor the advocates who had made it possible. As the founder of the trust that had inspired the legislation, I was being recognized as a keynote speaker. The event was held at the State University, in an auditorium filled with educators, policymakers, and scholarship recipients. As I walked to the podium, I saw Jennifer in the front row, now a second-year medical student, and David, who was completing his engineering degree while working as a tutor for at-risk students. When my family stole my college fund, I thought it was the end of my educational dreams. Instead, it became the beginning of something much larger, a movement to protect educational opportunities for students whose families have failed them. I talked about my grandmother's vision, about the trust that had grown from personal betrayal into systemic change, and about the dozens of students who were now pursuing their dreams because someone had decided their education was worth protecting. The Ruth Mitchell Educational Trust started with $25,000 and a broken promise, I concluded. Today, it has grown to over $200,000 through additional donations and has helped 47 students complete their education. But more importantly, it has changed the conversation about family financial responsibility and created legal protections that will help thousands of students in the future. As I left the stage to thunderous applause, I felt a deep sense of completion. My family's betrayal had been transformed into something beautiful and lasting. My grandmother's belief in education lived on in expanded form. And I had learned that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't revenge, it's transformation. That evening, I received a text message from an unknown number. It was from Marcus, who had been following the news coverage of the ceremony. Sarah, I saw your speech online. I wanted you to know that I finally understand what you were trying to teach us. I'm proud of what you've accomplished, and I'm sorry for the role I played in forcing you to accomplish it alone. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Thank you, Marcus. I hope you're building something meaningful for yourself, too. I'm trying, he replied, and I'm learning that meaningful things take time, effort, and personal responsibility. Things I never learned when family money was always available to fix my mistakes. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the year that had changed everything. I'd started as an angry daughter whose education fund had been stolen. I'd become a law student, a philanthropist, a policy advocate, and someone who had learned to set boundaries while maintaining hope for redemiliation. The scholarship recipients were thriving in their studies, protected by trust funds that would ensure their educational dreams couldn't be sacrificed to family dysfunction. My parents were slowly rebuilding their relationship with financial responsibility and with me. Marcus was learning to create his own success rather than expecting it to be funded by others, and I was preparing for a career in family law, where I could help other people navigate the complex intersection of love, money, and justice. My grandmother's legacy lived on, multiplied and magnified beyond anything she could have imagined. Education was being protected, students were being supported, and families were learning that love without accountability isn't really love at all. It had taken a year of pain, confrontation, and transformation. But we had all learned that sometimes the best way to honor someone's memory is to ensure that their values survive in the world, even when their original plans don't work out exactly as intended. The money my family had stolen from my education had become an education for all of us about what really matters: integrity, accountability, and the courage to protect what's important, even when, especially when the people who should protect it choose not to.